For over a decade, I shopped and worked at my local comic shop. One of the best parts about hanging out there was comparing notes on what I was reading with folks who shared my passion for comics. My comic shop is gone now, but we can still hold on to the magic of that in-store discussion. This is My Comic Shop Book Club. Welcome to My Comic Shop Book Club. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the first half of the Grant Morrison new X-Men run is my buddy from our old comic shop, Mike Sangregorio.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Listen, there's no one else I would even consider for this. Before we get into the run itself, and let me just lay this out for our audience here. For this episode, we're going to be covering new X-Men numbers 114 through 134, along with the 2001 annual, which is really just about the halfway point in the Grant Morrison new X-Men run. So beginning with E is for Extinction and ending right before Riot at Xavier's. And then in the next episode in 2 weeks, we'll cover the second half of the run. This is the first time I've done this on this podcast, splitting up a run like this. But I figure if we're ever going to do a two-parter, a Grant Morrison run makes a lot of sense. And as I was saying, you were the only person I would consider for this. You are the biggest Grant Morrison fan. I know you've enjoyed his work. You think about it. You've analyzed it. And I'm just so happy to have you along for this ride.
Yeah, no, I this is one of my favorite runs of all time. I've read it multiple times, and I was going to reread it anyway just because I felt like it, and then you mentioned it, and I'm like, well, I am on board. I did want to ask one thing though. Where are we on spoilers? Can we talk about things that'll happen later on, or would you rather keep that separate, or how do you feel about that?
You know, we did not talk about this beforehand. It's a great question. I was thinking about it. Because
there are significant spoilers in this run, so
yeah, and I'm going in previous episodes we have spoiled, and I've given a spoiler warning, and I'll issue one here too. So I think spoilers are fair game. I could be wrong on this, and if I am, listeners, viewers, let me know, because I'm just going based on the sense that I have, and I could be wrong. So please let me know otherwise. But I've gotten the sense that people who are listening or watching these book club podcasts, the sense I get is that they're checking it out because they've already read the run and they want to hear a discussion about it. Or maybe they're curious about it. Maybe this is the way that they're going to experience the run. Maybe they're never going to sit down and read, Grant Morrison's 40 issues on new X-Men, but they're kind of curious about it and they want to hear talk about it. And again, I could be wrong, but I would assume if someone really hasn't read it and wants to read it and cares about spoilers, they probably won't listen to this first, and that's fine. So spoilers are fair game. So listener, viewer, please be warned. But I'm glad you brought that up. And as far as spoilers, I think I know what's coming in the second half, and I think that's probably what you're alluding to. And I think it will make this conversation more interesting if we address it rather than, sort of try to dance around it. Now, right before we started, you educated me on a recent development with Grant Morrison and how he identifies himself. Would you mind just explaining?
Yes. So relatively recently, I'm not sure of the exact chronology, but Grant Morrison, the author, changed Grant Morrison's pronouns and now refers to themselves as a they. So though I'm sure you and I will do our most conscious effort to keep that in mind, if we do use he, it is not on purpose, it is accidental, and we completely respect the decisions of the author.
Yeah, and I appreciate you giving me the heads up. I was ignorant of this, and again, like you said, I will do my best to address Grant Morrison as or refer to Grant Morrison as they, but I suspect in the hour plus that we're going to be talking, I might slip, and if I do, again, it's not intentional, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, same here. It is absolutely not intentional. It's just something I'm getting used to. So yeah, please, a little bit of leeway would be great.
So before we talk about their run, right, I want to talk a little bit about Grant Morrison, and I want to talk a little bit about X-Men. You and I have, I don't know how exciting it is, but we have a little bit of a Grant Morrison story. I'll give the quick setup, but then I'm gonna toss it over to you. You and I attended San Diego Comic-Con together, 2016. We went as reporters for Bleeding Cool, and we've talked about that on a different podcast. But we did that. It was a lot of fun. We roomed together. I've gone on record as saying you're an impeccable roommate. You couldn't ask for anyone better. And one evening after the convention let out, we were leaving the convention center, about to venture out into the streets surrounding the convention center and grab some dinner and stuff like that. And, a whole crowd of people leaving the center. And we saw.
Yeah, we saw Grant Morrison and their entourage as they were leaving the building, and I maintain to this day that we just happened to be going in the same direction. But there is 100,000+ people who leave that building when that show is over, and we stuck with them for far longer than I thought we were going to. And it's funny because the year before that I had gone, I had actually had opportunity very quickly to meet them. I covered one of the panels that they were doing, and I got a great picture, and I had a great, one of those quick Comic-Con interactions. So it wasn't like I had never met them before, but yeah, that night it was like, oh man, I'm half hoping they're going to turn around and be like, would you guys like to join us for a drink? But thankfully we eventually broke up, and you and I had a very nice night. But yeah, it was only a Comic-Con.
Yeah. I mean, in my recollection, I feel like, I would describe it as a light stalking, because I know as you're painting this picture, I know you're describing it as like, oh, we happen to be walking in the same direction. I mean, look, yes, initially we were, but my recollection is that once you recognized, Grant, that there was a conscious effort on your part to continue walking in the same direction. The thing that always made me laugh was that, because again, this is the thing that stuck out to me, where I guess in my mind I was like, because look, I'm game, right? And if you had said like, I want to try to get a selfie, I want to try to get an autograph, I want to ask him a question, all right, but you you didn't vocalize any of that, and now my question was just like, what's the plan here?
I had no plan.
Believe
me, I was just going. Whenever I go to Comic-Con, especially San Diego, New York a little less so, but when I go to San Diego, it's just roll with it. I just want to see what happens. You never know. I guess maybe in the back of my mind, I was hoping that they were going to go to a restaurant that we could go to. Maybe we could buy them a drink, something like that. Maybe that was what I was going, but I have to be honest with you. At that point, it was probably pretty much just exhaustion. Because for anyone who's ever been, anyone who's never been to San Diego, it is pretty much just a marathon that you happen to have all within one building. And especially if you're covering it for Bleeding Cool, I mean, we were running around, from sun up to sundown doing stuff for articles. So I was probably exhausted.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I've never met Grant Morrison. I am an admirer of their work, not to the extent that you are, although in recent years I've definitely come to appreciate Morrison more. And it's funny because there's the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network Facebook group, which everyone listening or watching, you're welcome to join on our Facebook group. And just, I think it was last night, right, in advance of our recording, I posted the image of Morrison's new X-Men, and it pretty instantly got some feedback. There were a few who were like totally there for it, like, I love this run, it's my favorite run. Then there were others who were a lot colder on it. And one thing that came up a couple of times, there was one person who said, like, I don't get Morrison, and finds Morrison to be a bit too cerebral at times. And there were a couple of other sentiments that were along those lines. And I think for myself, I don't necessarily disagree. I mean, he's known for big ideas and being kind of a little out there. And I know you've read like everything he's done, including the Vertigo stuff, which I know that really, that's really out there. I found in terms of his superhero work, or their superhero work rather, pardon me, that, those crazy ideas filtered through a superhero lens tend to work pretty well for me. I find that those are usually a nice balance. I'll also say this, and I want to get your take. I found this run to be far more accessible than I expected going in, as someone who has read shockingly little X-Men. I mean, this is one of, a handful of X-Men runs I've read.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm going into this, knowing that it's Morrison without their ideas, knowing that it's X-Men known for often having convoluted continuity and a lot of stuff going on. And I found it surprisingly accessible. So, I don't know if that's something you can really speak to, because I know you're into both Morrison and X-Men coming into the new X-Men run. But for myself, I have to say, like, I really, at least in this first half, I found it to be quite approachable material.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, because my understanding is that before writing the book, Grant Morrison was not a huge X-Men fan. That's one of the reasons the book feels so accessible, because they were feeling their way as they go. And the best example of that is the introduction of Emma Frost, the White Queen, as a main character. Up until that point, she had been in the ancillary stories, she'd been an antagonist, and it's this run that solidifies her as a premier X-Man, actually headmistress of the school, whenever one of the main characters isn't around, which is consistent with her character. But I feel like this story at the time didn't land the right way because it was so different from what had come before. It's very different from Chris Claremont, and without getting too far into it, there are not two people who work in the same industry who could be more different than Grant Morrison and Chris Claremont, regardless of the fact that I love both of their work very, very much. But Grant wanted to tell a completely different story that was nonetheless set in that world. And I think accessibility was a big thing for it, because it's like they knew these characters were going to be in movies. They knew people were going to come to this run having never read all the nonsense that I still have in long boxes. And, you want to be able to give this to someone and be able to say, well, just read this, and if you like this, I'll give you more. But this is it. This is the Watchmen of X-Men, art notwithstanding. So I do feel it's incredibly accessible, and I think that was on purpose.
Yeah, that all makes sense. And that was really, I really went into this really trying to look at it in a vacuum, because again, I didn't have the body of material that came before or after. For the most part, I did read the Astonishing X-Men run, which I know in a lot of ways is very much like a spiritual successor to this.
Yeah, I would say so.
Written by the butcherer of Zack Snyder's Justice League. But anyway, so that's all I have to say about that. But so I really came in looking at this in a vacuum and really just saying, okay, this like a novel, right? Like I don't know what came before. I know stuff gets retconned after I read about it, but I was really just looking at this in and of itself. But I was reflecting and doing some math and going through the Marvel Unlimited app, and I was trying to place this in my comic book history. And at that point, so this came out in 2001. I mean, all through the 90s, I was only reading DC and really pretty much just the Superman books. And then slowly, in the late 90s, early 2000s, expanding. But the only X-Men I had read prior to this, and just prior, was the beginning of Ultimate X-Men, the Mark Millar run. The first couple of that I had read. And that certainly was that was a great entry point. It introduced me to all of the characters. It's funny because, you and I are both, came of age in the 90s. And I know, for a lot of people in our age group, the 90s Spider-Man and X-Men cartoons were huge. For me, I was there for that Spider-Man cartoon, like 100%. But I just missed the boat on X-Men. So that was one thing that you might have expected to grab me, and it didn't. So, really it was the movie. I mean, the movies, but especially that first movie, and then Ultimate X-Men, and then New X-Men. That was really, by the time I started reading this, that was kind of all that I had. And, I was trying to remember, I read, I don't know, maybe the first dozen or so issues as they came out, and then of Morrison's run. Mm-hmm. And then just like other things that I've mentioned on this podcast, it was, I continued getting the trades, and I was like, all right, I'll catch up. And I never did all these years later. So it was really a treat to reread those early issues that I read 20 years ago, but then to go beyond that. And I still have the second half that I haven't read yet. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun though so far. How did you enjoy your reread?
I enjoyed it a great deal. I've read this arc many times. But before we get to that, I do want to share an alternate reality story. So you may notice the shirt I'm wearing is Weapon Plus, which is referenced in the story, and it actually says at the bottom, Steve Rogers, Cap. This shirt is the very last thing I bought at our dearly departed alternate realities. So I saw that this was solicited, and I asked Steve Odo to buy it for me, but unfortunately by the time it finally shipped, the store had closed its doors for the last time, and I had to go to AR2 to pick it up. But this is a shirt I love very much. I've had it since then, and every time I wear it, I think to myself, brings me back to sitting on Central Avenue all weekend. So I was very, very happy that this lined up nicely, because as soon as I put this on today, I reflected back being in that store with you guys.
It's very nice, and it's perfectly appropriate for a show called My Comic Shop Book Club. That's where we met and became friends, and No, that's really nice. I'm glad you shared that. And we'll take a commercial break and then we'll get into this. The last thing I just want to touch on is just big picture. I really did enjoy, and I took my time with the first half of this run. And I purposely did not read ahead because I want it to be fresh when we do the second recording in 2 weeks. That was the main reason. But also, I was really just taking my time with this, especially knowing that Morrison can be kind of out there and there's a lot of stuff going on. Like, I just really wanted to really savor it and take my time with it. Like I said, overall, I found it very accessible, very approachable. I mean, I enjoyed it a great deal. The biggest roadblock I had, and I know we'll get into this more, once we really start going through the run, but the art, in the first 20 issues that we read, Frank Quitely, for all intents and purposes, was the quote-unquote regular penciler. And then I guess Van Sciver was like officially his initial fill-in artist and did a few issues. And we also had a bunch of issues, often random issues, by an artist named Igor Kordy. Now, this is going to test the bounds of my diplomacy because for the most part, look, it's like when we talk about these things, I never want to dump on a creator because I know it's hard to make anything creative, right? And I appreciate that. And, I might disagree with a choice that a writer makes or an artist makes, and that's fine. And that gives you, material to talk about. And I think that's fair game. But I never want to come out and be like, oh, that was just crap, right? Because I feel that that's reductive and that's unfair. But that art was rough. That was rough. It and I've not read anything else that artist has done, so I don't know if that was representative of the best of his ability or if it was rushed or what, but it looked rushed. But more than anything else, there was such a dissonance between Kordy's art and Quitely and the other artists who did that first half of the run. And that was the biggest roadblock to my enjoyment of the first half of this run. And it breaks my heart because it's like, and Quitely is not known for his speed. So I don't know that there was, unless he had, a vast amount of lead time, I don't know that there was any scenario where we would have gotten him to do, all 20 issues. But it's a shame because I think the run does suffer from the changes in artists and from that art in particular.
I agree. Artistically, it is incredibly inconsistent, and that's very unfortunate. Not that you don't get a smattering of amazing artists, but to use All-Star Superman or We Three or Flex Mentallo as an example, if you give Frank Quitely enough time, you get something that's going to stay in print for as long as this industry exists. And while the first 3 issues are amazing, yeah, the fact that you have to jump around artistically, sometimes in the middle of runs, it's just, part of me wishes they had just sat Morrison down and been like, how much time do you need to produce the best work? But unfortunately, this was not its own bottle series. This was in the main book. This was X-Men. This was, X-Men in 2001 is probably the premier book. I mean, this was long before the MCU, long before the Avengers, long before even the Disney purchase. Like, they probably needed new X-Men on the stands every month. And I don't know that Grant Morrison had the pull or was even offered the chance to do something like they would later do with All-Star Superman, which, I'm sure if you polled a dozen people, most of them would say that's their favorite Superman story. So it is unfortunate, but at the same time, the different artists lend itself to different work. Like, I personally love Lenny Liu's style in the annual. There's a couple of issues by Phil Jimenez later on, and all of that stuff is beautiful. But yeah, at the same time, if Quitely had done the entire run, I mean, it would probably be much more celebrated than it is pretty much on the 20-year anniversary, which it is right now.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too that frustrated me was, there was that one 3-part arc that Kordy did from start to finish, and that was fine. And it's like, okay, this is his arc. Again, I didn't love it, but fine. But it was like those random Kordy issues when clearly they needed to get the book out, and he stepped in. But that took me out of it more than anything. Like, when I was really in a groove, reading the stories, and I was like, oh man. And yeah, but in any event, it is what it is. There's still a lot of great art to be had in this run and a great story. Before we do our 30-second commercial break, let me just ask you, because I know you said this is one of your favorite Morrison runs. if you can, I mean, like, where does I don't know if you have a ranking in your head of them, but like, where does this fall for you? You know, we talk about his Batman run, JLA, the Vertigo stuff, All Star Superman. Like, where does this fall within that body of
Yeah,
work?
you're talking about just work by Grant Morrison.
Yeah.
Oh, this is one of my favorites because I love the X-Men. I mean, like you said before, just to give some quick background, uh, my two favorite franchises in comics are Spider-Man and X-Men. Like it's just full stop at that stuff. So I love the X-Men regardless of anything else. So the fact that a creator I very much like came on, took them to the next level, and for the most part, it's been celebrated ever since then. I mean, I've reread these issues so many times. It's like listening to a great song at this point. Like I'm barely paying attention to what's coming because I know it so well. But yeah, I would say, the only problem is that art. Like the only stuff I would put above this is probably like Flex Mentallo because that's entirely by Frank Quietly. A couple of the JLA parts again, where like Earth 2 again by Frank Quietly. Like it's a broken record, but when the two of them get together, it truly is some great stuff. Supposedly, Grant Morrison wrote the end of Superman Red Sun, which was otherwise by Mark Miller. That is my favorite Superman story of all time. So, whatever, they should be credited for that. But yeah, I would say New X-Men is one of my favorite comics of all time by Morrison. Otherwise, just I don't really have a lot of complaints about it. It's one of the things that I hold as the standard bearer for what I like about this. I've recommended it to everyone. I've defended it online, at cons, to people, and it's always the same thing. When I think about this run, I go back to a quote that Stan Lee supposedly said in an interview, which was, if he had stayed writing the original Marvel characters for longer than he did, and I don't know if this is true or not, they would be unrecognizable because him and Kirby and Ditko, they would have tore them apart and they would have put them back together. And I feel like when Morrison was given the X-Men, they did not grow up with that love for them. They didn't feel as reverent to them as they did for Superman or Batman or one of the other characters. And they said, well, how far can I push this? How far can I take leather-clad superheroes? And there's a lot of parallels with the Invisibles, which he was doing over at Vertigo at the time. But he doesn't play fair. He pushes the concept to the extreme, and when he leaves the book, it is an entirely different book from when he started. And I appreciate that because I think for the most part, I like it more afterwards. So I don't know if I'm in the minority for that, but I've read everything. So I can usually argue with someone for a good hour or two.
Yeah, right on. All right, let's take a quick commercial break and then we will get into this run. We'll be right back. Movie lovers should check out this family of film festivals: the Brightside Tavern Film Festival in Jersey City, the Hang On to Your Shorts Film Festival in Asbury Park, and the Point Lookout Film Festival on Long Island. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Also, be sure to listen to the podcasts hosted by the festival's organizer, CJ Cullen. You can find the official Hang On to Your Shorts podcast, as well as the Cullen on Film podcast, via a shared universe network. All right, and we are back. So, man, it's like where to start. Well, I guess we start with E is for Extinction, but can you just lay out for our audience, maybe they need a refresher, or maybe they are new to this run, as we had discussed before. What are, and again, we'll get into these more specifically, but can you just like outline, just like lay out, list the major plot points and ideas that we're working with in this first half of Morrison's run?
Sure. I would say the major things were, this is fundamentally a coming out story. Like up until this point, the X-Men reside at Xavier Institute, 45 minutes from where you and I are sitting right now, and they are protecting a world that hates and fears them. That's been their thing since Kirby and Stan sat down and drew this stuff. The difference here is that Morrison says, well, why? Why are you just being so insular? Let's bring the whole world into this. Let's bring them, bring them off the bench, as the Joker says in The Dark Knight. So I would say that the fundamental plot points of the first half of this arc are about making it not about just the X-Men, the 5 or 7 people that we're following in any series of stories. We're making it about the whole mutant community. Major things that are introduced very casually are Mutant Town, which is the Chinatown or Little Italy-esque part of Manhattan, which is in real life Alphabet City, where mutants live, dwell, and work, which was a very casual thing that was introduced, but one of the things that I really liked, because being from New York as you and I are, that's definitely something that would happen in real life. Other things too is this is the first run, unless I'm missing something, where there were students at the school that weren't just X-Men or weren't just New Mutants or weren't just named characters. It was in the movies. The first movie I think came out in 99, 2000. You certainly saw unnamed students there. And like I said, this book is 20 years old. And for the most part, there have been students at the school since then, which I love because it's a nearly infinite source of new characters, new mutations, new side stories. And it really expanded the world outside of just, hey, we're going to see what Wolverine does this week. And again, I love Wolverine, but he's got like 17 other books. And then the other thing I would say is that Grant Morrison made the characters really wrestle with whether or not they were going to kill. I don't know if you noticed this, but one of the things that they really discuss certainly in the first 10 issues or so, is all the characters talk about, well, we have to be better than everyone else. Does that mean we take lethal measures? Do we kill Cassandra Nova? Do we kill these other people? Or do we try to abide by the human laws which offer us no protection? And that's something they really wrestle with, which, not to say that they hadn't before, but now it seems to be explicit and seems to reoccur in everything they do, which I really liked because, the fundamental conflict in the X-Men is really, do we stay as outsiders or do we try to integrate ourselves? I mean, that is the story. All the stories fall in there somewhere. And sometimes it's more difficult than others. But Morrison said, well, what's going to happen when you actually do integrate? What is the world of tomorrow going to look like? And I think they did a stellar job at kind of showing you that. Now, it's unfortunate that when you get to the end of the Morrison run, if you've never read X-Men comics before, none of this sticks around pretty much at all, which is unfortunate. But for the most part, I would say it's about expanding the world they live in and figuring out how comfortable they're going to be with doing terrible things to people who do terrible things to them,
Yeah, and he also plays around with the idea of the secondary mutation. You particularly see that in the case of Beast, which is really interesting. I echo all of that, and that all resonated with me. I definitely appreciated, and again, even not having.
Wait, Anthony, before we get off the secondary mutation, do you know what that was about? Do you know why that comes out of nowhere? So
No.
I read something. I don't know if this is true. So for those who don't know, the comics internet back in 2001 was the Wild West. I don't know if any of this stuff is true, if I'm remembering it correctly, but I read something that said that the reason secondary mutation was introduced was because Grant Morrison wanted to use Colossus on the team. And he was told at the time, no, that character just died in a very, in a story we highly publicized. It would be disingenuous to bring them back immediately. So he said, okay, who else do you have? And, they sent him the list of well, here are all the X-Men related characters. And he said, well, I'm going to use Emma. And they're like, well, Emma's just a telepath. And it's like, no, we're going to make her living diamond. We're going to make her a real white queen. And they just did that. And then in the storyline, they have this whole thing about secondary mutation. And then they applied that to everyone else. They're like, well, why does Beast look like that? Oh, he's going through secondary mutation. I'm pretty sure in real life, Quietly just decided to draw him like that, which is fine. I mean, I love Frank Quietly's artwork, and they use it again with Quentin Quire and everyone else. And again, it's something I'm all for because I like seeing the characters change and evolve, and most of those changes have stuck around. But if I'm remembering this correctly, it was just like an out, if you think about it that way.
Gotcha. No, I appreciate the context. That does color it a little differently. It's interesting. But yeah, I mean, I definitely appreciated the building out of the world, the introduction of all of those non-X-Men students you mentioned, and a lot of them. And I know, again, the arc that we'll cover at the beginning of the next episode is right at Xavier's, and I think they have a lot to do in that. But even in these issues, they definitely have their part to play. And yeah, it was cool to see that built out. I liked the, at least initial focus on a pretty concentrated small scale lineup of the team, especially as a new reader, dealing primarily with Scott, Jean, Logan, Beast, Emma. Am I forgetting anybody? I mean, right? That's the
Charles. I would say Charles.
Yeah. But that was definitely, helped, kind of pull me in dealing with that smaller group. And I agree. I mean, at least in this first half, I mean, Wolverine is used effectively, but sparingly. I mean, he really doesn't dominate. And I think that's great because like you said, he has plenty of other appearances, all the time. So it's great to, have other characters, have a moment like that. And then we also have the beginning in this first half of the run of the psychic affair between, Scott and Emma, which very interesting. I mean, I definitely, because I do remember reading at least the beginning of that when I was a kid. And now as a married adult, I definitely look at it a little differently.
I think that's important. I think that's an important story because I think the way Cyclops was portrayed in the television show, in the cartoon, he got a short stick. He was portrayed, they tried to make him Leonardo from the Ninja Turtles. He's noble and he's the leader and he has the weight of the world on his shoulders. But the result is he's very boring and he's very uninteresting. And that's not the way he was in the original Chris Claremont comics, which, as far as I'm concerned, are the Old Testament here. But one of the things I like is that Morrison immediately, he did the classic Stan Lee thing where it's like everyone's going to have a fault. And yes, Scott can't see, everything's red or yellow or tinted however you want, but he's also terrified of his wife, who is the most powerful superhero that's ever existed. And he's tempted by Emma, who, unlike Jean, is very much into the school as a place. Very famously, Scott is the first X-Men in the comics. In the movies, I guess it's Mystique, but in the comics, he's the first X-Men. He doesn't have anywhere else to go. His parents, he thinks, are dead. The orphanage was not good to him. He was manipulated as a teen. The Institute is his home, and he loves it, and he'll give anything that he has to further the dream. Emma feels that way too, because Emma, when she was in the Hellfire Club, she had her own team of young students, and unfortunately they were killed, but she is a teacher at heart. Jean is not. Jean is more free-spirited, she's more dangerous, everyone's a little bit afraid of her. So I actually love the idea that, again, Emma, being relatively new to the team, would have an instant connection and give him a little bit to play with. You don't really notice that Wolverine doesn't have anything to do because suddenly all the other characters are much more interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree totally with that. So, as far as E is for Extinction, I don't think you could have asked for a more engaging and effective start to this run. To be honest, I mean, within the first half, within the 20 issues that we're talking about, and that's not to say that it was all downhill from there, but that was my favorite arc of the ones that we read. What was your take?
Yeah, I love E for Extinction because it is one of those things that you can't look away from. I mean, this was before September 11th, but right before September 11th, and to see Sentinels mowing down the relatively new mutant nation of Genosha is brutal, and no one is spared, and it's really this like caustic thing, and you're like, well, where do they go from here? And to see that turn itself around and say, well, okay, wait a second, there were 16 million mutants on that island, but there's a lot more in the rest of the world. Let's see what they're doing, and let's make sure that this doesn't happen again. So it was a great mission statement. The thing that jumps out at me for E for Extinction is them very casually saying, oh, by the way, the human race is going to die in like 5 generations, which I remember was big in the solicitation at the time, I guess because they didn't want to give away the Genosha reveal. But like, I don't know that that's ever dealt with or really acknowledged in a lot of ways. So I was always more interested in that. Like, wait, where are we going with that? But yeah, it was one of those things where it's like, I can't look away from it. I want to know more. And if you're taking Magneto off the board that early in the game, you're clearly setting something up. So
yeah, the potential impending extinction of the human race, that grabbed me too. And I think it's only I want to say it's referenced like once more in passing in this first half of the run. And yeah, it is the sort of thing where it's like, but there's so much going on that, that becomes a footnote, but you do have that in the back of your mind. And that's definitely, another factor at play as you're seeing all of this play out. It's so funny because, at the end of that first 3-issue arc, Professor Xavier, and then of course later we'll find out that it was Cassandra Nova, in his body. But at the end of that arc, Xavier, outs himself and his school to the world. Now, again, as an ignorant non-X-Men fan, I didn't even realize that they were unknown at that point. So I was like, oh, like that's really interesting. And then that's a huge jumping off point. And I thought of you, and because we've talked about the Morrison Batman run, on another podcast. Morrison really likes the idea of the global superhero corporation because I'm reading this and once Xavier comes back, right, and he sets up the X Corporation around the world, it's like Batman Inc.
So without getting too far into the weeds here, because I don't want people turning the video off. So Morrison's most well-known work is The Invisibles, and it's creator-owned, and it's Vertigo, and it's life-changing, and all the cult stuff you've heard people say before. But supposedly that when they were done writing it, they said, there's a way to look at the the centers of power in the modern world and want to bring it all down. And usually that's giant corporations. And Morrison said that when they got to the end of the Invisibles, they said they understood the other side a little bit more. And basically they said, well, why don't we, the revolutionaries, the counterculture, use these tools because they've been so effective? So you see in X-Men, the very first thing Professor X does when he gets his mind back is he begins the X Corporation. And there are numerous references to how much money he actually has because he self-finances the X-Men. You know, Emma Frost is a millionaire. The Worthingtons are millionaires. Sunspot, Monet. Like, there's a lot of money flowing around the X-Men, and I like the codification of that. Also, it allows, you were talking about how you didn't know many of the ancillary characters. The X Corporation is a great way to just bring in the rest of the characters. Like there are characters there that even I had to look up, like the character of Risk or Risque or however you pronounce her name. She was only in a few issues, like right before the book came on, and then Morrison murders her and moves on. And I love that because you get to play with this very rich universe. But then, yeah, in Batman Incorporated, he does the same thing. He says, wait a second, Bruce Wayne is, one of, if not the wealthiest person in this fictional planet. Why is he not doing more? And of course, that story ends in a tragedy as well. But it's this idea of like, why can't we use the tools of our so-called oppressors to fix things? Why does it always just have to be Roxxon and Luthor Corp? Like, why can't we have them too? Maybe we can make the world a better place.
Yeah, I mean it's a very interesting angle that's explored here. And yeah, going back to what I was saying earlier about finding this accessible, despite Morrison's out there ideas and despite being introduced to characters I had no familiarity with. I agree. I think that the global corporation was a nice way to kind of put characters in, and for ones I wasn't familiar with, I felt like I had enough. It didn't take me out of it. The other thing too is, as I thought of this I have a specific example, in with Phantom X, right? Is that how we say it, right? So in that arc, right, Phantom X talks about being put in liquid time, right, by the Weapon Plus program. Now, in the past, right, as a Morrison reader, that might have stopped me in my tracks. I might have been like, wait, what is that? I try to wrap my head around it. I've gotten to the point with Morrison, and this has helped a lot, whether it's the Batman run or this or anything else, where I've stopped feeling like I need to wrap my head around every single one of his ideas. Obviously, and that this has taken some time to really be able to pinpoint, okay, like what is actually important here for the character and for the story versus what is Morrison just doing for fun, right? And so I came to the liquid time thing, and like in the past, again, I might have been like, oh, what is he talking about? Now I was just like, all right, liquid time, sure, just go for it. So that helped a lot.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I mean, listen, when I read this thing originally, I hadn't read any of their other work. I didn't know what the heck was going on. I was very confused. The difference with this run and the runs that came before it and some of the runs that came after it is I kept going back to it because I couldn't stop thinking about it. I forget who said it, but the opposite of loving something isn't hating it, it's being apathetic about it. And you can't be apathetic about this run. Like, people either love it or they hate it, or maybe they don't even understand it, but you certainly form an opinion about it. And the liquid time and the other things that are just kind of thrown in there, I feel like that is a quick shorthand to kind of explain how new concepts and characters can work with the existing mythology, because it would have been very easy for a character, and I'm not picking on him, I love Chris Claremont, but if this had been a Chris Claremont book, the introduction of Weapon Plus would have taken 8 issues and 100 characters, and it would have been a very complicated reveal. Morrison drops it on you while X-Corp Paris is fighting in the Channel and all this other stuff, and they just move on because they want you to believe that, hey, super sentinels are being created by the military-industrial complex. You're going to have to deal with that. And they move on to the next thing, which I like because you can go back and you can reread it and you can kind of play around with that in your head, but you don't have to get bogged bogged down every time you read it. It's Liquid Time, great. He's an adult, even though we've never met him before. Fantastic. We're going to move on to the next thing.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that really, again, that really helped a lot. And, for anyone who, again, like those people in our Facebook group who talked about, finding some of the Morrison stuff like so out there, that really does help. I'll also say this, and I've said this on a lot of the recent podcasts I've been doing where I'm like, I'm not political, blah, blah, blah. And then I say something political. I'll just say this where, because I was really thinking about this. As a kid reading the beginning of this run and, seeing the protesters outside the mansion, right, calling for the blood of the mutants, and it's, again, we're 20 years ago, but I feel like my reaction probably would have been, not so naive as to think like, oh, prejudice doesn't exist, but I probably as a kid felt like, well, no, things have improved so much. Like, I don't know if I fully buy that would be the response. Now, as an adult and having seen everything that we've seen, especially in the recent past, those scenes of the protesters outside the mansion trying to break, like it really hit home and it resonated. And I really connected with the story in that respect in particular, far more than I did as a kid reading this.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I always go back to the cartoon where they just very casually introduced 10-story tall robots who were hunting private citizens who had done nothing wrong, and that one of the antagonists was the Friends of Humanity, who were completely non-powered, normal working class people who had joined a hate group because someone they knew might have had superpowers. But I think one of the things about the X-Men that's really interesting and puts it apart from everyone else, certainly like the Justice League or the Avengers, is that people aren't wrong to be afraid. I mean, Jean Grey once ate the sun. Like the mutants are incredibly dangerous, and I think the movies do a very good job at saying, yes, we know that's why we opened a school, not a training camp, not a military facility, but a school, because we want to teach people that we can build a better world together and that they don't have to be afraid. I always tell people that one of the interesting things that Jack and Stan did with the X-Men back in the '60s, when it was still just really a science fiction book and didn't have too much of the political allegory, is most of the evil mutants were ugly and they were adults and they hadn't had a chance to go to school. The Blob, Mastermind, the Toad, like they've been hated on for their entire life. And when a guy shows up who's flying in a red cape and says, we're going to get them, you join up. But Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch, who were younger and who were prettier and could hide their mutation, they were still hated, but they had a chance. And when Cap asked them to join the Avengers, they do. And for the most part, they never look back. There's obviously 50 years of story in there. But, it's this real idea of like, that's why it's important that they have a school. And Jean even says in that arc, you are here protesting, and I get that you're afraid. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be afraid, but I'd like to point out this is a building full of children. Like, this is not we're not an extremist camp. We're not terrorists. We're not any of the things you may have seen on Fox News. We're a school, and these are children. So please keep that in mind. And that's one of the things I always love, because it's anyone in that school could have a very bad day and could turn out to be a supervillain. But if the X-Men do everything right, it's going to be year after year after year of competent super people who can go on to save the world or cure cancer or do whatever they want. But it separates them from everyone else in the fact that they are, the Institute for Higher Learning.
Speaking of the school, and we touched on this before, right? All of these new students, non-X-Men students who were introduced. Any favorite or favorites that you wanna shout out?
It's so funny. At the time, I was confused because I was like, why are you showing me all these background characters? Like, again, this is before Harry Potter, the movies had come out and everything else. Like, I was just like, who are all these characters? I don't really care. But reading it now, with hindsight, knowing where many of these characters go, I love Beak. I absolutely love Beak, so much so. I love his introduction as basically an antagonist to the Beast, and I love seeing where his arc goes, especially in the very last run where you get to see him in the future as basically a proper superhero. And then the other characters I love are the Stepford Cuckoos. I did not understand them at all at the time. I didn't get them. I thought they might have been pre-existing characters from like Generation X. Seeing where they go, seeing how their storyline develops, and seeing how Emma commits to them because she wants them not to make the same mistakes she did really lands with me, because you get characters who immediately trust Emma while the other characters we already know are wondering, okay, what's the plot here? When does the Hellfire Club show up and kill us in our sleep?
Yeah, I'm with you on Beak, and I gotta say, it was heartbreaking when Angel kisses him, and he is just over the moon. I mean, literally, they're in space, and he's so happy, and then we find out that the Stepford Cuckoos had bet her that she wouldn't, and it's heartbreaking. But I'm curious. I'm looking forward to seeing where his story goes and the rest of it. But to your point, like you said, like at the time, initially you didn't really, you didn't get certain characters, right? And now you appreciate them more. I think that's one of the things about Morrison that I've really come to admire and value, especially in recent years, where, they are not the easiest writer, in a lot, even through that superhero lens. And I mean, I've not even read their Doom Patrol or Invisibles or Animal, like any of that stuff.
Doom Patrol, Anthony, you gotta read Doom Patrol.
I know. Well, maybe down the line. But even with their superhero stuff, again, as we're talking about here, some of it can be a little tough to digest, but it lends itself to a reread. It lends itself really well to, to revisiting at a different point in your life. And you can't say, I mean, I think you say that about a lot of comics, because I've been experiencing that now with these podcasts, going back to stuff, but not every book falls into that category. But, with Morrison stuff, it's like, yeah, especially when you're at a different point in your life, like you can find something different there. And that's the thing that I always admire. It's like, he's trying something. Like they are going for something. And even if it doesn't always land, or doesn't always land with you immediately, there's thought behind it, and there's a purpose. And so there's a lot of respect there, even if, there are stories that don't necessarily work for me or don't work for me initially, but then I go back to.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I always tell people that comics, especially since the period of time where you and I have been reading, they're expensive. They really are. And you got to buy them on a regular basis, and they come out every month, whether or not they're good. But with the Morrison stuff, the reason that I support them as a writer and their peers, we mentioned Mark Miller before. I'm a huge fan of his as well. This stuff is almost always rereadable. And I don't know if maybe it's coming from the UK, it's a different background. I don't know what it is, but there's much less disposability in their work. I like the fact that I can reread this arc 20 years later and I'm still finding more stuff about it, because I've never written a piece of fiction, but I'm almost certain that I could not do something that's going to stand up in 20 years. I just, you change so rapidly. And the fact that they were able to do this, that we're still talking about it, that I can talk about it for the rest of the night is amazing. One of the other things I'll say too is the big ideas, the more out there ideas, the more esoteric stuff. They famously said in interviews that they never put anything in there that you can't quickly find out about by looking it up yourself. So I know a lot of people say, listen, I want to read my comics and I want to forget about the world and I want to move on to the next thing. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I read a lot of comics and a lot of them are terrible. And I like the fact that I'll get through an issue of this and suddenly I have to look something up. And maybe it's annoying because maybe I needed more context in the story. But 99 times out of 100, when I've had to look up something that they've referenced, it's something that I'm interested in, and it's something that I keep reading about. So I know it's not for everyone. I would never tell everyone they needed to read The Invisibles or anything like that, but I get a lot out of it, and I know a lot of people who do too. So I think there's something there,
Yeah, that makes total sense. And again, like some of the feedback that we got, some of the folks who said like, I don't get Morrison, or, this was so divorced from the X-Men comics that came before. And I think someone even said that they prefer, the more straightforward superhero stories. Right. And again, like, that's fine. I mean, at the end of the day, this is entertainment and you should read and watch whatever you enjoy and what, based on whatever you're trying to get out of this experience, right? So it's fine. But no, I'm with you. I think, and yeah, there's a reason why, like, we're talking about this and why we're doing it over 2 episodes right? As opposed to some other things that maybe we wouldn't even cover at all, or if we did, it would be a quick
The
thing.
arc right before, you didn't call me up and say, Mike, I want to discuss Eve of Destruction and the 12. I mean, and I've read both of those comics and they have great art by Alan Davis, but you didn't ask about those. And why would you? Like, they were written at the time, they were for the time they came out in, and everyone moved on. This came out the next month. It's 20 years later. We're still talking about it. Some work stands the test of time because it's written that way, others by accident, and still more. It's like, well, it was due, and that's it. And that's fine. I bought those too.
As much as I'm the host and I've been guiding our conversation. I mean, you were by far the expert on this run. I mean, like I say, in a lot of ways, this was very outside my wheelhouse. I mean, where do you want to go next with our discussion of it?
I think the most important thing to discuss about this run is the fact that, the big bad of this whole run, not just the stories we read, is Cassandra Nova, and she is an incredibly complicated character. For those of you who at home who are listening to this, the one sentence pitch for her is she's Professor X's twin sister that he did not know about. She did not make it out of the womb, and she became a being of pure astral energy, and she showed up at his weakest moment to commit the genocide in Genosha. But one of the things I like about it is that she is the impetus for most of what happens in the story. It's she who decides to have him come out to the world and push all of this other stuff into the forefront. She's also the one who says, oh, hey, wait a second. Your ex-wife, one of your ex-wives, happens to be the empress of the largest empire in the Milky Way galaxy. So I'm going to go have some fun with that. And I like when Morrison does this, where they introduce a big bad that just effortlessly deconstructs the team, because then they have to react to that, and then the run moves very, very quickly. So I love that. I love the use of Cassandra Nova. I love the fact that she comes back in a very, I'll just say, unique way in the second half. Because it's not something I need to spoil, but I do like that, and we'll get to that in a few weeks. But I just love the idea of the dark version of Professor X, who is the originator of everything X-Men related, having this version of him that basically shows up and says, well, listen, Chuck, you haven't done enough. I'm going to push you to that other side. I'm going to make it so that you have to make all the decisions you're always too afraid of. And I think that's great, because I think the antagonist moves the entire, not just the story, but the entire franchise forward. And I very much hope that when Marvel starts bringing the X-Men back into films, that she is one of the villains, because she hasn't been used up until now, and I think people are ready for her.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you, has she been adapted in any X-Men, like cartoon or movie? I mean, I know not the movies because I've seen them, but not like nowhere else, right?
No. Unfortunately, the X-Men got shortchanged when Disney bought Marvel. They had a cartoon on the air called Wolverine and the X-Men, and that was canceled. And to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been an X-Men cartoon since then, owing mostly to the fact that they were owned by a competitor. But yeah, really, she has never shown up in anything, as far as I know. There's an X-Men anime out there I haven't seen, but no, she's a very complicated character, and she's one of those characters, along with John Sublime, who's another enemy in this arc, that I get into arguments with a lot of people because they're like, those are dumb characters. And I say, no, they're characters you don't like. They're not dumb, and let me tell you why. And then I never talk to that person again. But basically what I'm saying is, my favorite X-Man was always Magneto. I like the antagonists. I think the villains are the most interesting part of the story. And Morrison does a very good job at giving the X-Men new people to fight, because even if they win, something about them is still changed.
I think there's a lot of potential for Nova on screen, and given that Disney now has control, Feige's a smart guy. I feel like I feel like we would see that character sooner rather than later, especially given the fact that we've already had big screen versions of a lot of the other characters within the X-Men world. Like this is a villain who is tremendously effective and also new to movie viewers. So yeah, I think that would be really cool. Yeah, I mean, you talk again, that first arc, it's like it just grabs you and doesn't let go, and she gets such an awesome introduction. I mean, kind of laying out her philosophy to Trask's nephew, dentist nephew,
something like that. Yeah, the last living Trask, a criminally benign human being.
Right. And then, this whole idea of the Sentinel master mold and the ability to create Sentinels that can adapt to their environment, like that instantly ups, that threat. And of course, that's what, they destroy Genosha. I have to say, one of my favorite issues was, and this was a gimmick at the time when Marvel did their Nuff Said month, right? Where every issue was silent and there was no dialogue or narration. It was all just art driven. And I've not read all of them, but the ones that I read really were very cool and interesting. And I love the one here, and I'm so glad. I'm glad Quietly was available for that one. I'm glad Quietly was around for that one.
I am of the mind that if everyone, and I'm looking at you here, DC, if everyone wants to release Frank Quietly's books with no captions and no dialogue, I will buy them again, because that man is a master draftsman. That man is on Kirby's level. His art tells you a story. I go back to All-Star Superman. There's an issue where Clark goes to interview Lex in prison, and he quote unquote fights the parasite. You don't need dialogue. Like, Quietly walks you through that entire story, and it's beautiful. So yeah, to your point of the Nuff Said issue here, where there's no dialogue other than one panel at the end of the book, it's sublime. And honestly, and that was not a pun. It's one of those things where it's like, very famously, DC did a crossover where they introduced a host of new characters, and the only one that stuck around was the character Hitman by Garth Ennis and John McCrae. Here, it's the same thing. Every book Marvel published that month did a Nuff Said book. This is the only one that I have read since that month. And I'm not saying the others are bad, but they're not as memorable as this. And yeah, it was one of those things where it's like, every once in a while, actually, more recently, the current showrunner, for lack of a better term, of the X-Men line, Jonathan Hickman, actually did an homage to that. It was an expanded version of that story where Jean and Emma once again have to go through a similar odyssey, for lack of a better term. It wasn't as good, obviously, but the fact that they're still referencing that story so many years later, at the time it was considered a gimmick, I think speaks to how well it landed by those two creators.
Yeah, it was so strong. I mean, for anyone who hasn't read it or hasn't read it recently, I really do recommend it. I don't have the issue number offhand, but yeah, it's a silent issue drawn by Quietly. Emma and Jean go into Xavier's mind, trapped in the body of Cassandra Nova, to try to bring him back. And that's where we get the critical piece of information, right? That Xavier tried to kill her in the womb. And that's the last bit of that's the one bit of dialogue that we do get at the end of the issue. But it's just like, it was such a cool issue. Definitely a highlight for me from the first half that we read.
Yeah, and I remember at the time people saying, "Oh, that's ridiculous, that's nonsense." But I think it's important for people to remember that, Professor Xavier is a jerk, to quote Kitty Pryde. Like, he is willing to make many compromises to make things work. And I like in this story that even though he wasn't conscious of it, he didn't know he killed his twin or whatever nonsense, it's still this idea that, like, Professor X did something that came back to harm a bunch of other people later on. And I feel like that's very consistent with the character. It's like he makes a move trying to protect people, and other people end up getting hurt later on. I think that's really great. But one of the things I like about that issue is it exemplifies the way they beat Cassandra Nova later on. I think it's Jean, it might be Beast, says to Cassandra, "You don't understand teamwork. You don't understand family or connectivity or any of these things." And to me, that is the perfect way to defeat that character, because that is what the X-Men are. They rely on each other. They're not even the Avengers. They aren't just work friends. Like, again, they're students, they're classmates. Beast keeps saying, "Listen, Scott, I'm your best friend. I want you to be happy, and I want Jean to be happy. Like, I don't care about everything else. Like, please don't mess this up." And I like the fact that it takes both Jean and Emma, who that's probably the first time they ever worked together on anything before, go in to help Professor X, because even though they don't agree with everything he does, and Charles and Jean have a downright creepy Silver Age story, they both want him to be okay, and they're able to work together to accomplish that. And that's why Nova won't win. She can kill people all she wants, but at the end of the day, the X-Men are going to survive into a host of alternate futures.
Yeah, I love that too. That was a great, a great payoff to all of that. Because for many of those the first chunk of issues here, it's like Cassandra Nova's like thought of everything. She's many steps ahead. The fact that she doused them with these Sentinel nanites and made them all sick, and it's and to switch bodies with Xavier and all of that. It's like she seems near impossible to stop, and the idea that it's ultimately going to be the connections and the teamwork. That's what the X-Men's all about. So that was really cool to see that play out the way it did.
Well, one thing I did want to talk about, since we're jumping around, which by the way is a very Morrisonian way of looking at art, is jumping around randomly.
Yeah.
One of the issues that I didn't remember as well as I thought was the issue that takes place in Mutant Town that features just Zorn, and it deals with the 7-foot-tall 12-year-old. Now, for those of you who don't know, that was by an artist named John Paul Leon, who unfortunately passed away either this week or last week. So reading that right after I got in the news was particularly heartfelt, I guess, for lack of a better term. But that is an amazing story because, and this is why I asked about the spoiler tag, for those of you at home who don't know, Zorn is Magneto. I mean, that is the big reveal of this run. That is the most polarizing element of this run is, Grant Morrison always intended for the character of Zorn, which is why he wears a mask the entire run, to be, Eric Lensher, the Master of Magnetism, the X-Men's arch foe. So that issue I particularly liked because it's about a mutant who doesn't know any better being hunted by people because he's causing damage, but he doesn't realize he's causing damage. He's a 12-year-old. He just happens to be in this giant and vulnerable body. And unfortunately, he doesn't make it through the story. But it's a testament to that story where you can watch it, or read it rather, from Zorn's point of view about him wanting to help people and save this mutant and save this family. But reading it now, 20 years later, knowing that's Magneto, I expected him to just burn down the entire city because that's what he does. It's like, you dared to hurt one of my people, I'm going to make you all pay. So the fact that Morrison was able to make it consistent and make him bury that down so that he could still have his master plan, I thought was beautiful. And that really landed for me because I thought, John Paul's artwork was amazing. He did a book called Earth X around the same time. I've always been a fan of his. And the one, he also does the issue of, the story a few issues later, the funeral for Dark Star. I thought his artwork was perfect. And it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, would it have been good that one artist stayed on? Sure, but fill-ins are a way of life. And I thought John Paul's issues were amazing.
I'm with you, and same thing. He just passed, so sadly, and I hadn't read the issue yet, and I don't think I even remember that he did any in this. So it was it definitely hit me, but it was a pleasant surprise, to be able to revisit that. Where I love both of those issues. And all right, so as far as Zorn, this was what I wanted to ask you. Because I'm reading it, and the issue in particular that you're referencing in Mutant Town, it in the beginning it seems like it's being narrated by Zorn, and it is, but we find out that it's like a journal that he's writing, right? So so again, I've not read the entire run, but I read about it, so I don't know a lot of the other details of how the run ends, but I do know about that reveal. So as I'm reading this first half of the run, I know where they're going with Zorn. And so the fact that in that issue it's like a journal that he's writing for Xavier, it's like, well, okay, that tracks, right? He has to maintain his cover. The question that I have, and I know I'll be able to answer this for myself when I get to the second half, but I gotta know, for you having read the whole thing, when the reveal comes, is it explained in a way that really is satisfactory, that you can look back and say like, oh, okay, this all lines up, this all makes sense?
There's two ways to answer that. One is as a lifelong X-Men fan who watched Magneto go from this crazy person to a much more genial person who eventually runs the school under Chris Claremont's run, and who's a more cartoonish supervillain during the 90s. The reveal doesn't make any sense if that's the only stuff you've read. But if you actually read this run again, knowing that it's Magneto, I do think it makes sense because, like I said earlier, Morrison does not have the nostalgia and the deep, entrenched fandom for the X-Men that I'll use myself as an example that I did at the time. And the reason I liked it is because there have been so many Magneto stories told, and it would have been very easy to just say, well, we're not going to rely on Magneto. Sir Ian McKellen is doing a great job in film. Let's leave that alone. And Morrison said, no, listen, I may never write these characters again. Just like he does in Batman with the Joker. It's like, I want to make sure that I tell a great version of these iconic characters. It lands for me for two reasons. One, I buy the fact that Magneto is so arrogant, and he's such your traditional Machiavellian supervillain that he thinks he could become a teacher at the school to get the special ed class, no less, and think to himself, there's no way that I'm going to be won over by the innate goodness of the Xavier Institute. It's absolutely not. I'm a Holocaust survivor. I've suffered more than anyone's ever going to know. And then the second thing is there was actually an issue of Ultimate X-Men written by Mark Miller that has a similar plot line. So for those of you who've never read this, Ultimate X-Men number 20. I forget the name of the story, but it's a done-in-one story. Spoilers for that issue. It features a similar story to the Big Zorn reveal where Magneto has had his mind wiped and he, in a completely normal civilian life, becomes a devotee of Xavier's message. And it ends with Xavier meeting Magnus and him telling him, like, oh man, listen, I'm really happy I got a chance to meet you because I just wanted to say what a big influence you've been on my life. And Charles is vindicated because he realizes I connected with my old friend. I just had to get the malice and hate out of his body. So I think the Zorn reveal makes sense because I think that at the end of the day, Magneto always thinks that he is going to be right and he'll do whatever he needs to get to that. But I also want to point out for those people who stopped reading when it was revealed that that Zorn was Magneto is that Magneto doesn't accomplish anything that he wants to. Like if you read the rest of that arc, it's called Planet X. Eric fails, and he fails quite spectacularly. So I always remind people of that, of like, yeah, he pretended to be Zorn, but he didn't win. And not only does he not win, he causes all this damage that's immediately brushed under the rug by the next writer. So I think that's an important caveat to the reveal. It doesn't end with the reveal. He doesn't stand triumphant over the hero and just move on to the next thing.
Gotcha. No, I appreciate the feedback, and yeah, I'm very excited to get to that and to see how it all connects within the context of the story. That 2001 annual drawn by Lineal Yu, love his art. I'm on record. Birthright, one of my favorite stories. It was interesting. I had forgotten. Again, going back to I guess like gimmicks of the time, that it was widescreen format.
Marvel Vision, yeah.
Yeah, what I gotta say, so I read on my iPad on the Marvel app, and it was great on the iPad. It really it worked wonderfully. There's a lot going on in it, but there's one part that my favorite line in that annual, and I don't know why it tickled me so in the way it did, but when Zorn has had enough and he's gonna kill himself. And Scott's talking him down, and Beast goes, Scott's very good with the depressed. I loved it. And my favorite line of the annual.
Yeah, I love that because Scott Summers is a very uninteresting person. He just really is. And every once in a while, he gets to talk to someone else who's had not a great go of it in life. And he gets to talk them off the edge because it's just like, guy, I can't even take these things off. I don't even know what my kids look like. Like, believe me, we're going to be okay. That's not the line I thought you were going to say. My favorite line in that annual is when Wolverine is talking to Domino and I guess he is smelling her and he just goes, oh, what are you doing after this mission? And they're fighting like, Chinese cyborg killer robots or whatever. And she goes, yeah, you just can't just hide the excitement of a battle. And then it's, presume they're going to go off and have relations afterwards. But I remember it being so casual at the time because they really didn't do that in the X-Men books. Domino was this X-Force character and it was just this very like, sophomoric like joke, like something you'd see in a teen movie. But I just always look back to that where I was like, yeah, why not? They're consenting adults. They're both used to murder rampages. So that's the one I always go back to.
Yeah, no, that stood out to me as well. Yeah, it didn't take the top spot. Scott is very good with the depressed. That's my favorite line. But
Do you know
yeah,
what Cyclops was doing before this run starts? Because it's a pretty big deal. It's referenced a bunch of times during the arc.
well, that he had been controlled by Apocalypse, right? Was that the? Yeah,
Yeah. So there was this huge build up to the 2000 to the millennium changeover, whatever it was, and it ends with Scott sacrificing himself to take Apocalypse off the board, and they I don't know they go off and they do something, but the whole idea is that he and Apocalypse are the same entity for a little while, and the original intent was that when he comes back, he's not the same guy. So this is a guy who's basically gone through an incredibly traumatic experience and he's still processing it.
gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I was able to, and I mean, I could have done some Wikipedia research, but I felt like the run gave me enough context that I was able to, to kind of piece that together. Yeah, I mean, through this, it's funny because I don't know, I guess I don't have that strong an opinion on Scott, but I do like the idea of, I mean, yes, literally he has all of this energy that he has to keep inside, but the fact that there's so much emotion, anger, whatever it is that he keeps bottled up as well. I thought was interesting. This is separate, but I wanted to get your take on this as well because we haven't talked about this yet. The fact that this run took the characters out of their traditional costumes and
Oh yeah.
right and put them in leather, very much akin to what we had just seen a year or two earlier in the movie. And then of course, I mean, I guess they would stay in that right until they have to astonish them again, and they put their costumes back on. But what was how did you feel at the time, I guess, about the lack of costumes?
It didn't bother me for two reasons. One, the X-Men have always changed their costumes. Like that was the thing that, like, people were very annoyed at the time, and I was like, yeah, but those costumes you're used to from the cartoon, they only came out in 91, 92 when Jim Lee redesigned them, and I love them. But it's like the X-Men are constantly changing, and the other thing that you know occurred to me is Scott even says it. These are school uniforms. Like the X-Men have always worn this yellow and blue unitard or something else like that. Like they have school uniforms. So the idea that they're going to open up their school to other people and they want to have a consistent look to themselves just made sense to me because again, it seemed like an evolution of the brand. I will say though that when Astonishing X-Men came out and they had that very famous scene of, well, we have to wear costumes because superheroes wear costumes. That's one of the things I was talking about before, where it's like, people were tripping over themselves to undo this run once it was over because, Scott says, like, I don't understand why you wanted us to be superheroes or rather someone else says that and then Scott says, well, Professor X thought it would be more familiar. Like if people thought we were the Fantastic Four or the Avengers, they might trust us a little bit more. They might not try to murder us. But I like that here. It's just like, no, you know what? We belong to a school. We're going to wear our logos. I don't quite know why Logan doesn't wear a shirt. That part I never got. But having seen the Wolverine, I get it now as an adult. So no, it never bothered me. I think of the X-Men as characters who have a litany of different costumes drawn by some of the greatest artists to ever live. So I don't know. It never fazed me.
It's funny because I haven't been keeping a tally, but from you've mentioned this numerous times about how you've had to defend this run, and again, it's like I was very much out of the loop for most of this. Like I said, I read the beginning of it, and that was it. And I knew about the Zorn thing, but I mean that was about it. But so I mean, it seems like you've really had to fight. You've had to fight on behalf of this work.
I mean, listen, there's one thing about comic book fans that unites all of them no matter what, and it's that they like arguing. That's it. That's the only thing that unites everyone. We'll argue with anyone about anything. And the Morrison run is very divisive because it takes everything that you had grown accustomed to and that Marvel said you should grow accustomed to, and it changes it. And it does it in a very violent, very aggressive way because Morrison, I think, wanted to bring in new readers. They weren't interested in just having me and, the other guys at AR read this thing. Like they wanted to get everyone to read this and to talk about, change and evolution and the future world we were building for ourselves. Again, before 9/11. 9/11 happens during this run, but all of this stuff is right before. and it didn't land. I mean, the biggest thing that I'll say is that, Morrison doesn't work at Marvel once this run wraps up. They go back to DC, and they have celebrated runs at DC. I've read all of it. Most of it is very, very good. And Marvel, for whatever reason, I don't know, maybe they weren't ready for this. So I think a lot of it is just people reading other books and saying, well, these changes that you're so fond of, they didn't land, they didn't stick around. And I would say that's true. But now, 20 years later, I would point to the fact that people who are our age and who read those at the time and are now making these books, they're fans of the Morrison run. So yeah, maybe at the time, Joe Casey and Chuck Austin and Chris Claremont and the other ones, didn't quite know how to facilitate the changes. It stuck around. Morrison is more Kubrick than Spielberg, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about that, because again, it's like I don't have any attachment to really any iteration of the X-Men, to be honest. So it's like I don't have a horse in this race. I just want a good story, and I feel so far halfway through the run I've gotten that. But I've definitely been in situations with other characters where maybe there have been changes I haven't liked, or maybe there have been interpretations of certain DC characters that I've loved that other people have been very much opposed to. And so it's like I do get it. Yeah, I mean, I think all of those things you said. I mean, maybe in a post 9/11 world, maybe this wasn't what people were necessarily looking for. Maybe it really was just ahead of its time. Maybe. Do you think there was any aspect of the hardcore fans feeling like, especially with the lack of costumes and maybe some of the themes that were explored, that it was seen as too much of an attempt to try to like mimic the movies? Do you think, was that something at the time that fans were kind of feeling there? Did you get that sense?
I didn't get that sense at the time, only because, the first movie came out, and the first movie, costumes aside, is very much an X-Men story. Like, they fight the Brotherhood of Mutants, and Senator Kelly is there, and
Right.
it does check a lot of the boxes. I think what happened was, you know, if you describe the X-Men to someone, it's like it's people who, when they hit puberty, they're going to get superpowers, but unlike, and I'm not picking on them, but unlike the Justice League, they're not always good powers. Rogue can't touch anyone else. Scott can't look at anyone else. Like, they're your classic 50s science fiction EC comics. They come with a downside horror story. So I think Morrison looked at that and said, well, wait a second. Why are we stopping with that? Why are all the characters beautiful superheroes with the occasional acknowledgement that something is wrong with them? Why aren't we pushing that to its natural level of saying, you know what, everyone's messed up, and the story is how you overcome that? To go back to the John Paul Leon story about Mutant Town, Beast, or no, excuse me, Beast or Zorn, I don't remember which one, but one of them actually says that if you had given the character's not given a name, but if you had given the 7 foot tall 12-year-old 10 more days, they would have become something else. And I think that is a big theme about this run, is its evolution. The Sentinels at the beginning are the evolved form of the classic Kirby Sentinels. Kirby drew giant purple robots. That's awesome. That makes a lot of sense. Those same creatures became Nimrod. Those same creatures now became the Chicken Sentinels, the Nano Sentinels, the Mega Sentinels. Like, it's the same idea, but it's evolved. And I feel like that is a theme that runs through the work. The very last issue, I think it's issue 134, you see a young mutant who's drawn beautiful, and they're cool, and they're the big man on campus. Mm-hmm. And then Quentin Quire, Kid Omega, the next big bad in this arc, reveals that no, they're a tiny web-footed creature who were using their ability to get well liked. And that, as an adult, that just lands with me, because it's like, oh my goodness, yeah, are you kidding me? If you had superpowers and you were a teenager, that is absolutely what you would do. That's what you would do as an adult. So I think a lot of those themes didn't land at the time because they're not things you want to read in your superhero book. You want to read about beautiful people saving the world and doing amazing things. And the Morrison run's not about that. From Ugly John through Beak, through Angel, through everything else that happens later, it's about change and how difficult change is when you're going through it.
Well said. The other thing, you touched on this before, I guess this was something else, another character you defended, but John Sublime and the U-Men and all of that I dug it. I thought it was interesting because it was another it was another angle, and it was another, it wasn't humans who hated mutants and wanted to eradicate them. It was humans who wanted to be mutants, but the way that they became mutants was by killing mutants and harvesting their organs. But I thought it was was an interesting aspect to this, that I guess is introduced right in the annual, and then we have the germ-free generation arc, right, where the U-Men like launch their assault on the mansion.
Yeah, I really like that storyline because, again, you mentioned before how the protests maybe didn't land at the time because they seemed too outlandish, but certainly now they make a bit more sense. Literally during that arc, Jean Grey calls, I don't know, the Salem Center Police, the
Yeah.
Westchester Sheriff's Department, whomever she would call, and they say, well, yeah, you know what? You deal with that. And then armed guards, the U-Men, a well-funded private army with high-tech weaponry, attack a school with a bunch of kids that they want to murder and bring them down. And there's a saying where it's like, you know, to have the protection of the law, you have to follow the law. And the people at this school, the X-Men and their students, have now been told that the law is not going to protect you. Well, what other course do they have other than to attack them? And that's when you begin to see Jean become the Phoenix, which again is kind of a shout out to long-term fans because you know that there's no greater antagonist for the X-Men than the Phoenix entity. So it's kind of scary too because she's going to stop the U-Men. Of course, she's going to stop the U-Men, but she might also destroy the moon, which is brought in later on when the Shi'ar show up. But one of the things I really like about John Sublime is where his character goes. So here he's kind of just a straw man. He's a little weird, but of all the characters we've been introduced to so far, his is the arc that takes the most 90-degree turn in the second half. So I'm gonna just leave it until then because it's so weird and it's so esoteric. I say let's just table it for the next time because none of the really weird plot elements for that character have even been hinted at. So let's just table that for now.
Okay, fair enough. That works for me.
Yeah.
The other thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but was the idea that Logan wasn't Weapon X, but was rather Weapon 10? That was a new idea for this, right? Or had that been done before?
No, that was brand new. And in
Yeah.
fact, I was going to mention that next because that when Phantom X tells Professor X that, oh, it's not Weapon X, it's Weapon 10. And by the way, there's been an entire program with that includes Captain America and Nuke and all these characters in the Marvel universe that she thought had nothing to do with each other. I just remember thinking like, oh, okay, I liked Weapon X, I liked all that stuff, but I love this and I want to see more of that. And please give me a Weapon Plus ongoing. No, that was introduced right there, and it was so elegantly well done that it's stuck around. I mean, there was a Weapon Plus book, I think, last year, and Jason Aaron did a great Weapon Plus annual where he had Phantom X team up with another Grant Morrison creation, the Marvel Boy Novar. So it's one of those things where like that stuck around. A bunch of this other stuff people didn't quite catch on, but the idea of like, oh no, Weapon X, that thing that made Wolverine into a human killing or a mutant killing machine, is far larger and far more dangerous and far more well resourced than you thought. That was all Morrison, and I love that they just drop it on you in the middle of this arc.
Yeah, it was good. That's something that I think I remember us talking about at the shop at the time, and yeah, I thought that was such a cool idea because it's like, yeah, of course you would just assume it was an X, right? But like it's yeah, and that's Morrison's brilliance, I think, where it's like it's right there, like it's right, it's right there. So but it's it hadn't been done before, and that's what I thought was the case. But I just wanted to confirm. Yeah, I thought that was
think
that
of
was cool.
it from their point of view because it's like if you're not an X-Men fan and you read Weapon X, you're like, why? What the hell is it called Weapon X for? He hasn't even met Professor X yet. It's
Right.
like it could be Weapon 10 for all you know. And I don't know if you know this. Have you ever read the Barry Windsor Smith story Weapon X that introduces all this mythology?
Yeah, I might have read it once, like years and years ago, and I don't remember it
It doesn't
well.
matter. My only point is that they don't ever use the term Weapon X to refer to an organization or anything like that. It's more thematic. It's more like, Logan's identity has been taken off the table. So he is just Weapon X. He's Weapon Unknown. And it was so popular that it really built up and built up, and other writers added to it. But Morrison was the first person to say, okay, wait a second, I agree. I really like this. The fact that the military industrial complex would use people that come pre programmed with superpowers to do terrible things makes a lot of sense. But, it has good and bad. It starts with Captain America. It starts with them saying, hey, we have to defeat the Axis powers. But the guy who came up with the super soldier serum was unfortunately killed. What else do you have? And it's like, well, we're the Marvel Universe. We have Eternals and Inhumans and Immortals and all these other characters. Why don't you play around with them for a while?
Yeah. Yeah. It was just so clever. It just opens up the world, in a really cool way. So I dug that a lot. Yeah. And the character Phantom X was cool. Again, that was the Igor Korty, like his full arc that he did all at once. It was a little tough. We haven't talked a ton about, again, how Nova takes over the Shi'ar Empire and directs them at the mansion and all. I guess I don't have a ton to say about that. What if anything do you want to say about that arc and that development?
One of the things I like about the Shi'ar, who, unlike the Kree and the Skrulls, they don't deal with too many other aspects of the Marvel Universe. Excuse me, they're mostly an X-Men thing. One of the characters actually says, that they were very proud that it were mutants that made contact with one of the first civilized interstellar empires, the Shi'ar, and that it was this idea of like, well, the Shi'ar don't want to destroy us the way the Skrulls or the Kree or someone else do. They're just kind of like, oh, hey, you guys discovered space travel and now you have genetic anomalies. Congratulations, welcome to the larger community. And then, after dealing with the X-Men for so long during the Dark Phoenix saga and everything else, Cassandra Nova is the first thing to make them go, oh man, we should not have come to this planet. You guys are rough. And I love that, because I love the idea that they would just write us off and be like, no, I don't know what the heck that thing was, but it did way more damage than we thought. We have to go back home. We have to deal with this. You guys are on your own. Just have fun. We don't know why that redheaded woman's on fire. Just deal with this stuff. We'll come back. We'll come back if you're still here in a generation.
Yeah. I have to say, like, that arc, that was we talk about accessibility. That one was a little tough for me, not having any connection to or knowledge of any of those characters. Again, the story gave me enough and I was able to follow it, certainly, but I wasn't, in terms of like my level of investment, it was kind of low, with that arc. But I still enjoyed it. I thought it was cool. And again, it leads to, what we talked about before with, teamwork finally being, how they're able to overcome and save the day. So I thought that was cool. What else within this first half of the run did you want to touch on that we haven't gotten to?
I just want to go back to Phantom X because I love that character. I really do. I love that he's witty and clever and creative. I love that he lies to all the characters. I love that he's French for no reason other than the character he's based off, Fantomas, is French, and the fact that he thought it sounded cool. I love the arbitrary nature of the character because I think it's Morrison's commentary on superheroes. I always say that Phantom X is Gambit done right. I don't like the character of Gambit. I don't think he's all that interesting. I don't like his head sock. I never found the character to be all that interesting. But I like Phantom X because he's got a lot of the same overlap. He's a thief. He wears a long coat. He's got random French words thrown in, but he's also, got this whole life outside of his dealing with the X-Men. And I always thought like, oh, that's a rogue I can get behind. The other thing I like about Phantom X is that he stuck around. He was in the books for much longer than many of the other characters. And in fact, I think he still might be in the books today, which always made me very happy. He actually even had his own series for a while under the Max line. So I love him. I think it's great that no one can tell if he's telling the truth or not. I love the fact that he can play the X-Men like a fiddle. And I love the fact that he randomly has a flying saucer because, why not? Why shouldn't he? Who cares? I just think it's all great.
Yeah. Yeah, he was a cool addition. And I was not aware of his legacy beyond this run. So, yeah, it's funny. You've mentioned a number of things that I might check out at some point, once I get done with the rest of the Morrison run for our next conversation. So speaking of that, so we'll be back, in 2 weeks. And now I scouted ahead and I saw that in the second half of the Morrison run, it's, I believe, 5 arcs. If I'm correct for it, right? It's like a handful of arcs.
That
And
sounds right.
the sense that I got just from like looking at the covers on the Marvel app, the arcs seem more clearly defined than the first half of the run, which I felt was a little more fluid. I mean, obviously there are certain lines of demarcation there, but looking ahead, it looks like we have like a handful of very clearly defined arcs, and again, artistic consistency within each arc. So I'm excited for that. I'm excited to see the Zorn reveal and again see how it all connects and how it's explained. Yeah, I'm excited to see where this goes and how it wraps up. Anything else that you want to say about the first half before we sign off?
The only thing I would say is, you're talking about the consistency in the second half. You have to remember that this was back when trades started to become a big deal. That was really big with the Ultimates stuff, the Ultimate Spider-Man and Ultimate X-Men. Every 6 issues, you got a trade paperback, and it was affordable, and it was right there on the shelves. And something similar happened with this run, because it became obvious that, like Sandman or Daredevil or these other things, people who didn't go to the store every week like you and I wanted to read this. So trades needed to get together and get out. So I think as things became a bit more popular, you do get a bit more consistency. I think it's the last run on Here Comes Tomorrow, where you literally have Mark Silvestri work on the X-Men, which was a huge deal, because though he had worked on the X-Men in the late 80s, he went off and he found a Top Cow and he did all this stuff with Image. So to come back to Marvel and to do this book, like, that was a huge deal. Like, that was probably Marvel's big event of that year, and to know it was on New X-Men just should give people who are, maybe a little unsure about the run, just an idea of how big it got. Even if it started from a weird place, by the end, everyone was reading it, even if they weren't enjoying what they were reading.
Gotcha. Yeah. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate all of your insight on this. I'm sure you could easily do another hour and a half on this. I don't know if honestly, like, do you feel like we only just scratched the surface, or are you satisfied, I guess, with the level of depth that we got here, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, no, listen, I think that every time you read a story by Grant Morrison, for the most part, you can get something else out of it. I think for Here, I really like talking about it with you, because I like the fact that you liked it, even though you don't have anything to compare it to. And I think that's great, because I think that's the point of the run. But yeah, obviously, whatever the heck Cassandra Nova is supposed to be is rooted in a whole bunch of philosophy stuff and all this other stuff. Like, you can read this a different way depending on what you're interested in. But at the end of the day, it was meant and it was sold as a good superhero story. The only other thing that really jumps out at me is there is this like team dynamic that is built in this run that I don't think gets enough credit, because you see it again with Astonishing X-Men. You see it with the movies, where it's like, okay, wait a second, there are many, many, many characters for the X-Men, and every one is someone's favorite. But here we're going to focus on 5 of the big ones, and we're going to focus on their relationships, and we're pretty much not going to acknowledge anything else that happens in the other books. And that seems like it would be very easy to do, but you have to remember that at the time, everything was really interconnected and everything crossed over, and you had to buy all the different books to get it. So the fact that editorial was even able to say to Grant Morrison, well, like, listen, you're in charge. You're going to do whatever you want with this book, and we think sales are going to be very good, and they ultimately were. We're not really going to mess around with you. It's not, at no point did you turn to me and say, oh, by the way, we should read the tie-in to the Joe Casey run or the Extreme X-Men run. It's like, you didn't have to do that. You got a story from one book. And I think that's a big reason as to why the book is still popular all these years later, because you can give it to someone who doesn't know that they have to read all these other books. They can just read this one, and they can get a good story out of it. Not just a cerebral story, not just a action adventure story, but a story about characters you actually want to know what happens next. And that, like, very basic premise, I feel like, is something a lot of comics, even at the time, didn't have.
It's funny, because I didn't really think about that specifically, but I'm so glad you mentioned it, because that is so true and so rare, for superhero comics generally, and especially X-Men. That is such a great point. The fact that, and to be perfectly honest, had that not been the case, if reading this run required, diving into, all the other books that were going on at the time, I probably wouldn't have done this. So yeah, I mean, as podcaster, but also as reader and as X-Men novice, it's like, yeah, no, it's true. I didn't really think about that, but I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah, I mean, I really do appreciate the fact that this run stands on its own, and that you don't need. And I mean, I guess the same thing's true, for his Batman run. I mean, obviously it tied into Final Crisis, but that was his own story. So
that was his story.
Yeah. So yeah, I am glad that he's given the leeway to do stuff like that. And I do think, for sure that lends itself to his work, like we've been saying, right? Being their work, being stuff that can be revisited and can stand the test of time, because it can exist in and of itself. There really is something to that.
And the flip side of that is true, because you asked before, like, why do I have to constantly argue with people about this run? Which, by the way, I enjoy. I very much enjoy arguing with people. You've seen me argue with everyone about everything. So, imagine you're the age we were. You're a teenager. You're working on a limited budget. You go in, you buy your X-Men books. There's this one book everyone is reading. It's a little weird, but, it's still good. And then you buy 4 other X-Men books that month. But none of them seem to have anything to do with each other. It's kind of understandable that you'd be a little annoyed. Like, I remember... I don't know if we've gotten to it, but there is a story in one of the other X-Men books. So this was New X-Men. The other one going on at the time was Uncanny X-Men, and that had a few writers, one of which was famously a gentleman named Chuck Austin, which we do not need to get into here. But there's an issue that he wrote that featured Cassandra Nova, which does not make any sense if you just read the Morrison run. Where the story leaves off and where it continues, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Which, again, is fine if you're just reading that book, because it's a big bad, it's something they have to deal with and you have to move on. But it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, 20 years later, I'm still reading the Morrison run. I'm not going back to read all of that other stuff. Like, it was good at the time. You enjoyed it. There are some great bits and all that other stuff. But again, that was written by people who wanted to work at Marvel and wanted to tell that story and wanted to, make sure you really enjoyed what they did. And I feel like Morrison was like, you know what, if I don't write the X-Men once I'm done with my story, I don't really care. And that ended up happening because they went back to DC and they wrote, amazing stories that continue to this day. And I wish my dream, I don't know if I ever told you this, my dream project for Grant Morrison is very simple. I just want them to write Fantastic Four. That's it. I don't care if it's in its own continuity or it's in normal continuity, but if I could get a Grant Morrison Fantastic Four ongoing for as long as they want to write the book, I would happily buy 3 copies an issue. That is my dream. So, I don't know where I was going with this.
Well, seconded. That would be awesome. Well, listen, thank you, Mike. I really do. This was a lot of fun. And again, there's no one else I would want to go on this ride with. So thank you. And thank you to everyone who listened or watched. This was part 1. We'll be back with part 2 in 2 weeks. And until then, remember, they're all imaginary stories. My Comic Shop Book Club is a Flat Squirrel production. Art by Mike Sangregorio, music by Basic Printer. If you like what you heard, be sure to check out my other podcasts, Digging for Kryptonite and My Comic Shop History. Sign up for exclusive content, including the official book club companion podcast, at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato, and watch my documentary film, My Comic Shop Country, out now on Apple TV and Amazon.